Thank you very much. So my PhD is funded by Curtin University and CSIRO through the National Research Flagship. You see all these other universities. CSIRO has also provided funding to those universities. So it's about 18 people doing a PhD across Australia on coastal adaptation. The title is Improving Coastal Adaptation in the Context of Climate Variability and Institutional Complexity in the NAR. So I'm looking at our region, so from Kalbarri to Geraldton. My supervisor is Laura Stoker from Curtin University, and my co-supervisor is Dr. Ben Preston, who's here. And that's the link. And I would like to thank in particular the City of Geraldton for helping me and working with me, especially Mark Chadwick and Andrew Outway. They've been really supportive. I believe that if you do research, you gotta have a good relationship with your decision makers, and I do, so I'm really lucky. So the image on your left is a funny image. The image on the right is actually Long Island last year, and it's reality. That building and one of those buildings were left, were abandoned, and the local government and the state government are not going to protect them, so they had to leave the house. And they've raised them first, and then they couldn't cope anymore. So if I was a resident, I am a resident, as a resident, I would like to know how decision makers are planning for the future of our coastline, where we're going to put new development, how we're going to build new facility infrastructures, so new design in areas that are at risk of erosion or inundation. We looked at really cool maps. Ben showed us really cool maps with areas at risk, areas most vulnerable. We don't have that for our region. So our new developments could happen in areas that are actually very high risk, and we don't know until we get in detail, we study the area and we say, oops, actually this is a very high risk area. So we don't have those maps at the moment. So identifying where the areas at risk are is very important. Understanding what tools planners need to support strategic land use planning decision and development assessment. So when our decision makers have to decide on approving or not new development, what do they need to know? What level of details do they need to know? Otherwise, well, the developers would just go as close as they can to the water, basically. And also I mentioned institutional complexity. This was a little exercise that we did with Curtin University. We tried to map the governance around coastal erosion. And look how many people, how many actors, DEC, local governments, NRM regions, everyone has a little say or a little influence on decision making. And at the moment it's a bit uncoordinated, but it's also due to the fact that decision making is now more decentralized, so local governments have more power or more responsibilities, but it's causing a bit of a confusion of who is doing what and who has to pay and who's liable for things. So my other question as a resident is, all right, how can decision makers best calibrate their response to the impacts of climate change? And what governance arrangements will best support coastal adaptation? Maybe our governance structure and processes could be improved. Maybe we need to be more similar to Victoria or maybe to New South Wales. How is that working? As a resident, I have no idea what's happening, and also as a researcher. And how should priorities for action on adaptation be established? And how can we prioritize? So once we know that we are at risk and once we know that we have to do something, how do we get the funding? How do we prioritize these actions in a small local government where we have to build hospitals and roads, and we have to be very careful how we also manage the rates in the small local governments. So Ben has already showed all the vulnerability assessment happening in Australia. In WA, we have at the moment Mandurah, Cottesloe, Busselton, and Geraldton doing some works. And every single approach is a bit different. So what I'm looking now with my PhD is at the governance systems. So identify the barriers within the current governance system to coastal adaptation in an hour. How these governance systems influence the process of undertaking climate change risk assessments. The barriers in translating coastal vulnerability findings into responses and outcomes. So once we got all this data, we finally made it. What are we going to do with it? And maybe looking at alternative forms of governance, which will best support science uptake and transition towards adaptive coastal governance and management. So maybe our formal governance could be improved. What can we add? Where can we take? What lessons learned can we take from other state governments and other states and basically improve because we always improve. It should be an adaptive process and improve our system. So these are my case studies. I'm looking at Geraldton as the main one, Mandurah and COTTESLOE in WA. The city of Clarence is very, very proactive in Tasmania. A couple of studies in Victoria. I have to choose which one, Adelaide in South Australia and the Sydney Coastal Council. This is an example of what COTTESLOE has been doing. Now, these few examples show you what they're doing in terms of technical information. Underneath, there is a governance structure that works in a different way. So Geraldton and COTTESLOE are different, and COTTESLOE is different from Tasmania. So all different actors involved, processes, policy, local policies, and funding. So sorry, if I go back to previous. So what the COTTESLOE did was, okay, we want to know how vulnerable we are. And they developed these maps. On the left, it's if the area was only sand, where the shoreline would be under different scenarios. And on the right, if it was rock underneath. You may ask, oh, why don't they know if it's rock or sand? Well, they didn't know. So they got their own funding to study, to look at the scenarios, and then they got more funding to do a geological assessment. So they actually drilled down and they looked at if there was sand or rock, because they can put out a map saying, oh, this is the line in 2100. Maybe underneath is rock, and it's not going to be that bad. So the community, you can't just put out a map like that and the community's going to freak out. So they did a very thorough assessment of the geology, which is great. The problem is it costs a lot of money, so the stretch of coast was actually quite small. So the scale is very important in vulnerability assessment. And COTTESLOE is not a big local government, so they didn't have a lot of funding, so they did what they could, which is great anyway, great outcomes. They haven't looked at any socioeconomic vulnerability, they haven't looked at doing anything, it was just purely knowing what's underneath and how vulnerable that land is. Mandurah didn't like that, didn't like lines. They say, no, we don't want lines on the map, that's too, subject, they change very often, we don't like that. We want to divide the land in compartments and in sediment cells. We want to look at all the risks, and they also included socioeconomic values in their assessment, and they came out with adaptation options per compartment. So per single area on the coast, they look at all the different risks and adaptation measures. So very thorough as well. And then once they've got that, they're going to drill down and maybe go number 8, 12. They're going to do sediment budget, geological assessment. But they couldn't afford to do what COTTESLOE did in all the Mandurah area. Too big. They've got inlets. They've got canal estate development. Just too big. Mandurah had a very strong governance. The mayor is on the National Coastal Council. So she's very proactive, strong leadership. And they got funding and they did their study. This is in, do you say Gippsland? Yeah, Gippsland. Again, another lines on the maps, different scenarios. And then they did an inundation mapping, looking at all the different, one in 20 years or one in 100 years. And then they also came up with some ways to build around the area with different type of buildings, and so some adaptation strategies. This is Geraldton. And also Geraldton is doing a lot. Geraldton is, again, looking at understanding the coastal dynamics by doing sediment budget analysis, by looking at wave modeling, and they're doing a really good job too, with the funding that we have, with the structure that we have, and with the support that we have. So again, I think all these local governments are doing a great job. So if we look at what Ben was talking about before, in a lot of these approaches, we're still here. We're still trying to understand how the system works. We haven't even touched on population density, capacity of the local government. We haven't done that at all. So you see, it's a very long-term process, and you need a lot of commitment. You need leadership, and basically the whole community driving these processes. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So far, I've looked at all these policy documents. I've looked at all the vulnerability studies, and I've conducted 23 interviews in WA with all decision makers. And Mark Chadwick and I are working on a workshop in June with the decision makers, and hopefully we're going to look at the governance structure and see how we can improve it, and how we can maybe get into partnerships or get the state government to be involved a little bit more and kind of improve that. And also between May and September, hopefully I'll do interviews in other states. So far what I've learned is 1 year into my PhD, that sound evidence-based science is very important for decision makers. I interviewed a few people in the region, and some still don't believe in climate change. So I was like, oh, right, okay, why is that? The science is too uncertain. How can we make decisions? So we got to work on that. We got to present the science in a better way, maybe. We got to educate the community and involve the local government. So there is still a bit of work to do with climate science. That local scale vulnerability assessments are very important, and they require detailed information, which costs money. One of the critical gaps is understanding of local geology. That's essential, and I don't think we've done much of that. Coastal councils need assistance in assessing the data and applying this data into decision making. And liability is another big issue that is like, right, okay, how are we going to tackle that? And only a few people actually have a grasp of liability in our country. So we're lucky that the next conversation series, hopefully we'll have an expert on liability. Then we need collaborative approaches. Down south, Mandra, all the way down to Albany, they're just forming a new alliance, and there's 5 local governments, and they all want to do vulnerability assessment. If they don't form this alliance, they're not going to go anywhere. Funding is very competitive. You either have everyone on board, or it's not going to happen, unless you want just $50,000. But as we know, it's pretty hard to do works like that. So partnerships across local governments, very important. And also, what we lack at the moment is consistent, accessible funding. So there is funding out there, but it's 1 year, then the funding disappears, change of government, no more funding available. Then you get a funding body, but it gives funding only to important national projects, and you're like, oh, well, no chance in Geraldton. So it's really hard to get the funding for adaptation. And then leadership and long-term commitment. So get the CEOs on board to sign a good memorandum of understanding across local government, and then you start working. Sure that you've got roles and responsibilities all agreed, and you can do some good work. And this is it. This is me. Thank you.